What if truth didn't vanish? It was silenced. The story doesn't begin with a body or a headline. It begins with a question. Why do the people who try to tell us uncomfortable truths so often meet the same fate? Sudden, tragic, unexplained? In the hidden architecture of modern life, there are few constants, but one pattern keeps repeating. Men and women with access to unsettling truths about power, wealth, and control, gone. Not with a storm, but with silence. Their discoveries buried with them. Across industries, pharmaceuticals, finance, technology, energy, brilliant minds and wealthy insiders reach a certain threshold. They see behind the curtain. And then, just before they speak, something happens. They disappear. They die. They vanish from the headlines, their warnings diluted into rumors. Is it coincidence? A symptom of stress, pressure, paranoia? Or something more deliberate? The story you're about to hear isn't about conspiracy. It's about pattern recognition. It's about what happens when information becomes too dangerous, when evidence threatens to rupture the foundation of institutions. This is not about what is proven. It's about what is possible and what is lost. A pharmaceutical titan found hanging beside his wife days before testifying about industry collusion. A tech pioneer with a data trove meant to disrupt global surveillance, dead in a cell before the upload. An activist with no history of illness, gone overnight, her files erased. This series isn't a court case. There are no closing arguments, only a trail of questions and the echo they leave behind. These aren't just stories of how people died. They're stories of what they knew and what we were never meant to hear. Maybe it's not that the truth dies. Maybe it's that, sometimes, the truth is buried under layers of fear, denial, and distraction. And the voices brave enough to unearth it are swept away in the process. Over the next 13 chapters, we'll walk through the final days of 10 individuals, brilliant, wealthy, and bold. People who believed in something larger than themselves, who in their own way tried to show the world a hidden structure pulsing beneath the surface of daily life. They weren't perfect. Some were flawed, eccentric, even paranoid. But they all had one thing in common. They held a key. And as they reached to unlock a door the rest of us didn't know existed, the handle vanished beneath their fingertips. We'll begin with a home in Toronto. A winter morning. A couple found side by side, their wrists bound, their secrets intact. And we'll end with a question. In a world built on layers of silence, what happens to those who try to speak? It started in the quiet suburbs of Toronto, December 15th, 2017. Snow still clung to the windowsills of an expansive mansion. Inside, Barry and Honey Sherman were found seated beside their indoor pool, lifeless, posed, wrists bound behind them with leather belts. The scene resembled a ritual more than a crime. Police first called it a murder-suicide, but the evidence disagreed. There were no signs of struggle, no note, no history of depression or violence between them. And the configuration of the bodies? Forensic experts would later call it physically impossible for one person to achieve alone. Barry Sherman wasn't just a wealthy man. He was a disruptor. As founder of Apotex, one of the world's largest generic drug manufacturers, he had challenged pharmaceutical giants for decades. His company undercut brand name prices by up to 90%. For millions of patients, he was a silent benefactor. For Big Pharma, he was a threat. In the months before his death, Sherman was preparing to testify before a Canadian parliamentary committee. He had uncovered what he believed to be a vast price-fixing scheme involving brand-name pharmaceutical companies, insurance providers, and regulatory agencies, billions of dollars at stake. Powerful people implicated. 3 weeks before his death, he had submitted evidence to Canadian health authorities. Emails, ledgers, contracts, records that hinted at backroom deals keeping drug prices inflated while pushing affordable generics out of reach. To some, he was on the verge of unveiling one of the largest corporate frauds in Canadian history. Then, without warning, he and Honey were gone. Private investigators hired by the Sherman family found signs the official inquiry ignored. The couple had likely been tortured. Restraint marks, wounds inconsistent with the official cause of death. The autopsy revealed neck trauma that didn't match the story of a hanging. Surveillance footage from nearby homes vanished. Witnesses went silent. Perhaps most telling, within days the police transferred the case from homicide to financial crimes. Files disappeared. Leads were dropped. And the committee Sherman was to testify before postponed its hearing indefinitely. What if he had lived? His testimony could have triggered over $50 billion in penalties for pharmaceutical firms. But more than money, it could have revealed how drug pricing wasn't just flawed, it was rigged. What does it mean when the most generous man in Canadian healthcare, a billionaire who gave away hundreds of millions, ends up erased just before he speaks? And why did the world move on so quickly? There's a quiet cruelty in the way information dies, not with violence, but with bureaucracy, with sealed autopsies, with redacted reports, with silence that stretches far beyond the walls of a crime scene. Barry and Honey Sherman's story isn't just a mystery, it's a symbol of how truth can sit on the edge of revelation before being swept into shadow. And the question that remains isn't just who did it, but who benefited from what never got said. The world knew his name long before his death, but it was what Jeffrey Epstein knew that may have sealed his fate. August 10, 2019. In a Manhattan jail cell, Epstein was found dead, an apparent suicide. He had been awaiting trial for federal charges involving the trafficking of minors. But beneath that surface was a darker layer, a network of secrets that may never be fully uncovered. Epstein wasn't just a financier. He was a collector of names, of faces, of footage. For decades, he had orchestrated a web of seduction and surveillance. Cameras embedded in walls, recordings of high-profile guests in compromising moments, presidents, princes, CEOs. Each visit to his properties, whether the Manhattan townhouse, the New Mexico ranch, or his private island, was another page added to his book of leverage. He kept a black book, thick with names. He kept fuels, hard drives, photos. Allegedly, a vault of evidence that could collapse careers and maybe even governments. 2 weeks before his death, Epstein had begun speaking to prosecutors, not out of guilt but strategy. He believed he could trade information for leniency. He had already hinted at the names he might mention, some of the most powerful people on earth. Then, in the early hours of that August morning, the impossible happened. Surveillance cameras in the jail failed. Guards fell asleep. His cellmate was removed, and the suicide watch, standard for high-risk inmates, had been lifted without proper documentation. The autopsy results raised more questions than answers. Multiple fractures in the neck, including the hyoid bone, a break more consistent with manual strangulation. Blood patterns that didn't align with hanging. But within hours, the narrative was set. Suicide. The FBI raided his properties that same day, seized thousands of documents, servers, and photos. Evidence that, to this day, has never seen the light of public scrutiny. The investigation ended where it began, with Epstein, and no follow-ups, no trials, no accountability. As if the entire network of power he had helped construct vanished the moment his heart stopped. What makes this story different is how much was at stake. If Epstein had testified, if the recordings had emerged, the ripple effects would have been seismic. But instead, he became a dead man with no voice. And the secrets he carried were recast as myth, tabloid, distraction. Sometimes the most effective way to erase a truth is not to hide it, but to ridicule it, to make it sound too wild to believe. But the silence that followed his death wasn't relief, it was fear. A silence that echoed across boardrooms and royal halls and marble-lined corridors. Not because one man died, but because what he knew almost didn't. And so we're left with a ghost, a man who built a labyrinth of exploitation and may have been eliminated not for his crimes, but for his cooperation. The question now isn't whether he did it. It's, who needed him gone before the walls collapsed? He lived like a myth and died like a warning. John McAfee, the flamboyant founder of the antivirus empire, was never one to follow rules. He had money, brilliance, and madness in equal measure. But beneath the eccentric interviews and tattooed proclamations, McAfee harbored something else. Information. The kind that governments don't forget. On June 23, 2021, just hours after Spain approved his extradition to the United States, McAfee was found hanging in a Barcelona prison cell. The story was simple: suicide, but the trail behind him suggested anything but. McAfee had long claimed to possess files, classified, incriminating, global. He called it his dead man switch, a digital trigger that would release sensitive data should anything happen to him. He tweeted cryptic warnings, wore a tattoo that read "WACD," and told reporters, "If I die like Epstein, it wasn't suicide." What did he claim to know? Alleged mass surveillance by governments using consumer antivirus software as a backdoor. Secret cryptocurrency manipulations coordinated by central banks. A global network of data harvesting, financial tracking, and control mechanisms cloaked in the guise of security. In his final months, McAfee was building a decentralized communication platform, one that would allow anonymous interaction without government oversight. He said it would shatter digital control systems and expose the machinery of mass monitoring. And then it all vanished. His servers went offline within minutes of the news of his death. The dead man's switch never triggered. Supporters called foul play. Authorities claimed it was a straightforward suicide. The truth fell into a void. Inmates reported strange sounds, shouts, multiple voices in the hours before McAfee was found. Security footage from the corridor was unrecoverable. And before his family could even arrive, his body was cremated, eliminating any chance for an independent autopsy. Was it paranoia or preparation? McAfee's life had always danced on the edge of reality and theater. But in death, his story quieted in a way that didn't match the chaos he thrived on. If his claims were delusions, they died with him. If they were truths, they were buried even deeper. The line between genius and madness is often thin. But McAfee's greatest fear wasn't that people would doubt him, it was that they wouldn't even look. And so the man who once helped protect millions from digital viruses may have died trying to warn the world about one more, a system built not just to watch us, but to erase anyone who sees too much. What remains is a puzzle with missing pieces. And one final question: when does a man stop being a risk and start becoming a message? She didn't plan on becoming a crusader. Brandy Vaughn began her career inside the machine, working as a pharmaceutical executive for one of the industry's giants. But what she discovered there shook her faith, and once she stepped outside, she couldn't turn back. On December 8, 2020, Brandy was found dead in her California home, officially natural causes. She was 47, fit, and had no history of illness. Unofficially, something was wrong. The timing, the warnings she left behind, the quiet deletion of her work. Vaughn had become one of the most vocal critics of vaccine safety data in the U.S. She wasn't anti-science, she was pro-transparency, and her past inside Merck gave her a credibility few whistleblowers carried. She founded Learn the Risk, an organization that exposed how pharmaceutical companies allegedly manipulated safety trials, suppressed adverse reactions, and worked hand-in-hand with regulators to fast-track approval of questionable drugs and vaccines. Her core message was clear: informed consent is impossible when information is hidden. She spoke publicly about what she'd uncovered: internal documents, ghost-written research, deliberate omissions. Most controversial was her claim that the U.S. vaccine injury reporting system captured less than 1% of actual adverse events. If true, the public had no clear picture of risk. In the months leading up to her death, Brandy documented a pattern of harassment, break-ins where nothing was stolen, furniture subtly moved, anonymous threats, surveillance vans parked for hours outside her home. She posted video evidence. She filed police reports. She told friends, "If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident." When she died, her website vanished. Her files were wiped from cloud servers. Her videos were pulled down, and her family's requests for a full autopsy were denied. Why would anyone target her? Because she spoke calmly about the one thing the pharmaceutical world couldn't afford: accountability. Not outrage, not hysteria, just facts, questions, and an unwavering refusal to be silenced. Brandy knew she wasn't invincible, but she believed the risk was worth it because too many others couldn't speak. Parents, patients, doctors in quiet disagreement. She gave voice to a conversation others weren't allowed to have. Her death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It marked the sudden halt of a growing movement, a movement that asked, who decides what information we're allowed to see? And what happens when someone exposes the answers? In a world that demands faith in institutions, Brandy Vaughn became dangerous not for what she opposed, but for what she revealed. And now, her silence leaves behind an echo. Who protects the truth-tellers when truth itself becomes the threat? It wasn't a battlefield where John Wheeler III died, but it might as well have been. On the last day of 2010, a sanitation worker in Delaware made a chilling discovery: a body in a landfill. It was Wheeler, former Pentagon official, West Point graduate, consultant to multiple presidential administrations, a man who had served his country for decades, found discarded among the trash. Authorities called it a tragedy, perhaps disorientation, a fall, exposure. But Wheeler's last known hours told a different story: confused behavior, missing time, and apparent paranoia that friends said didn't match the man they knew. Wheeler had been investigating a network of financial corruption, a trail of misallocated Pentagon funds, offshore accounts, and shell corporations linked to defense contractors. Billions of taxpayer dollars vanishing under the radar. He suspected that large banks were involved, helping launder illicit funds through false documentation, shielding illegal arms deals and covert operations. His access to sensitive contracts and military budgets gave him a unique window into how public money could quietly become private profit. Wheeler wasn't just researching. He was ready to report. Congressional hearings were looming. Evidence was being compiled: emails, contracts, bank transactions. He had already sounded alarms to colleagues. And then, in the final days of December, he vanished. Surveillance footage later showed him disoriented, wandering through Wilmington. No known destination. Some suggested mental breakdown. Others saw a man being followed. The investigation didn't linger long. No suspects. No explanations. No autopsy transparency. The documents he carried were never found. In the months that followed, those who had worked with him were reassigned. The inquiry into defense contractor fraud quietly dissolved. And his death became a cautionary tale, stripped of its larger context. But perhaps what matters isn't just that Wheeler died. It's how he was buried. Not just in the landfill, but in memory. In a silence so complete, his warnings might as well have never existed. He once said that the real danger to democracy wasn't enemies from abroad, it was secrets kept within. So what does it say when a man who tried to expose those secrets ends up discarded in the dark and no one asks why? Maybe the question isn't who killed John Wheeler. Maybe it's, what did he know that no one wanted to hear? January 11th, 20th, a cold winter morning in Brooklyn. Aaron Swartz, a digital prodigy, was found dead in his apartment. The official story? Suicide by hanging. He was 26. But Aaron wasn't just a brilliant coder. He was a visionary, a co-creator of RSS, a Reddit pioneer, and perhaps most dangerously, an idealist who believed that knowledge should be free. At the time of his death, Aaron was facing multiple felony charges for downloading academic papers from JSTOR, a digital library. The government painted it as theft. Aaron saw it as liberation, returning publicly funded research to the public. But that was only part of the picture. Behind the headlines, Aaron had been working on something else, something far more sensitive. At Harvard's Ethics Center, he had begun documenting how tech giants, Google, Facebook, Apple, were quietly partnering with government agencies to enable mass surveillance. Long before the Snowden leaks, Aaron had traced the outlines of the digital panopticon being built behind closed doors. His findings were staggering. Secret data sharing agreements, backdoor access to private servers, entire architectures designed not just to serve users, but to monitor them. He planned to release it, all of it. At an upcoming conference, he was preparing a talk that colleagues described as explosive, a look into the surveillance state hiding in plain sight. Then came the pressure. Federal prosecutors threw the book at him, decades in prison, millions in fines. Supporters believed it wasn't about the JSTOR papers. It was about silencing a voice that knew too much. Aaron insisted he wasn't suicidal. He had plans, projects, people counting on him. But the legal assault was relentless. And one day that bright thread of resistance snapped. After his death, the government sealed his research. The files were never made public. The presentation he was working on? Gone. Aaron once wrote, "Information is power, but like all power, there are those who want to keep it for themselves." He lived by that belief, and some believe he died for it. What if Aaron had spoken? What if the public had seen what he saw, that the Internet, once a tool of liberation, had become an instrument of quiet control? We'll never know the full scope of what he uncovered. But the silence that followed his passing speaks volumes. In an age when knowledge is hoarded and transparency punished, Aaron Swartz stood as a beacon. And when that light went out, a part of the Internet's soul dimmed with it. Some stories vanish quickly, others are erased with precision. Gary Kildall wasn't a household name, but in the early days of computing, he was a giant, a software engineer, an inventor, and quietly, a revolutionary. Long before Microsoft ruled the world, Kildall created one of the first personal computer operating systems, CP/M. It was foundational, and it could have made him one of the wealthiest men in tech history. But Gary had a different vision. He wasn't chasing billions. He was chasing change. In the 1990s, Kildall turned his focus to energy. Using the same systems thinking that made him a pioneer in computing, he began developing software for distributed power grids, networks that could allow neighborhoods and towns to generate, store, and trade renewable energy independently. No more monopoly utilities. No more inflated prices. It was radical, and it was dangerous to the wrong people. His platform would have decentralized energy in the same way the Internet had decentralized communication. His code allowed households to become micropower stations, sharing electricity like files. If released, it could have disrupted oil giants, gas conglomerates, and legacy utilities. Kildall refused to sell. He wouldn't license the tech. He planned to release it as open source. And then, on July 11, 1994, he was gone. Official reports said he suffered a head injury during a fall outside a bar. But witnesses gave conflicting accounts. Some saw men in suits watching him. Others recalled an altercation. The medical examiner's report was vague. The police closed the case quickly. Soon after his death, his lab was broken into. Not ransacked, surgically cleared. Computers missing, backups gone, no arrests, no suspects. His energy software never surfaced. Gary wasn't paranoid. He was hopeful. He believed in systems that empowered individuals, in tools that broke down monopolies, in futures built on access, not profit. But systems of control don't yield easily. And when technology threatens to shift power away from the few and toward the many, resistance becomes ruthless. Kildall didn't leave behind a manifesto. He left code, quietly revolutionary. And then silence. Maybe the question isn't just how he died, but what we lost when his vision was buried. What if one man's dream of energy independence had become reality? And who decided the world wasn't ready for it? Michael Hastings believed in stories, especially the ones no one else wanted to tell. He was an investigative journalist, bold and unflinching. His reporting brought down generals, exposed hypocrisies, and unsettled the powerful. But in the end, it wasn't what he had written that made him a target. It was what he was about to reveal. June 18, 2013. In the early hours of the morning, Hastings' car sped down a Los Angeles street and crashed into a tree at full throttle. The explosion was so intense, firefighters needed over an hour to contain the flames. His body was unrecognizable. The crash, they said, was an accident. But the timing didn't sit right. Just hours before, Hastings had sent a chilling email to his colleagues. He said he was being investigated by the FBI. He said he needed to go off the grid. And most of all, he said a big story was coming, a story that would challenge everything. He had been digging into media manipulation by intelligence agencies. Operation Mockingbird wasn't just history, it had evolved. Hastings believed the CIA and other entities were now embedded in digital media, steering narratives, silencing dissent, even generating fake grassroots movements using AI and bots. His research uncovered how journalists were being surveilled, how editorial decisions were quietly influenced, how dissenting voices were algorithmically buried while government-aligned messaging was amplified. He wasn't theorizing, he had documents, sources, and recordings, and he was scared. After his death, security experts raised questions. Modern cars, like the one Hastings drove, can be hacked. Throttle controls can be overridden. Steering can be manipulated remotely. It's not fiction. It's been demonstrated. Witnesses reported his car accelerating unnaturally before the crash. There was no sign of braking, no skid marks, and no toxicology report that could explain his state of mind. The story he was working on? It vanished. Federal agents seized his electronics. His notes were never returned. The editor at Rolling Stone confirmed the upcoming piece would have exposed the deep connections between media corporations and intelligence networks. But now that story exists only in fragments, in interviews, in unverified files, in whispers. Hastings once said, "The greatest lie the media ever tells is the one it tells by omission." He died trying to tell the truth they'd rather we forget. So we're left with the wreckage, not just of a car, but of a moment when the truth nearly surfaced, before it burned. And the quiet question that lingers, who controls the story when the storyteller is gone? She was never meant to be a whistleblower. Karen Silkwood was a lab technician, a union member, a mother. But when she uncovered something terrifying inside the Kerr-McGee plutonium plant where she worked, silence was no longer an option. By 1974, Silkwood had documented evidence of widespread contamination, workers being exposed to dangerous radiation, safety violations ignored, records falsified, and worst of all, radioactive materials disappearing without explanation. She gathered proof, internal memos, lab results, photographs. She knew it wasn't just negligence, it was systemic, and it endangered not only employees, but entire communities. On November 13th, she set out to meet with a New York Times reporter and a union official. She carried a folder filled with documents, papers she believed could expose the truth. She never arrived. Her car was found crashed into a concrete culvert on a deserted stretch of Oklahoma highway. Her body was inside. The folder was gone. Authorities called it an accident. They claimed she fell asleep or lost control, but the evidence suggested something else. There were skid marks behind her car, indicating she had braked suddenly. Paint scrapes pointed to contact with another vehicle. Toxicology reports showed she had taken sedatives, but friends insisted she'd been alert and cautious all day. And the documents, the ones she risked everything to share, were never recovered. After her death, government and corporate officials denied wrongdoing. The nuclear plant eventually shut down, but no criminal charges were ever filed. Her story faded from headlines, buried under red tape and corporate stonewalling. But Karen's death sparked something deeper. Her bravery inspired others to question the industries we're told to trust. Her name became a symbol of resistance, of one woman daring to stand against a system designed to keep her quiet. Years later, her story was retold in books and films. But even then, much of what she uncovered remained classified, sealed away, like the radioactive particles she once tracked in the lab. Silkwood's life ended on a dark highway, but her warning lives on. In every industry where profit eclipses safety and every agency that chooses silence over protection, her voice still echoes. And the question remains, how many truths have we lost on the road between discovery and disclosure? Karen Silkwood didn't want to be a martyr. She just wanted someone to listen. Are we listening now? He was a father, a doctor, and a quiet voice in a storm of controversy. Dr. Jeff Bradstreet wasn't looking for a fight. But when he began treating children with autism and seeing results few could explain, he found himself at the center of a growing divide between mainstream medicine and alternative inquiry. On June 19, 2015, his body was found in a North Carolina river, a single gunshot wound to the chest. Authorities called it suicide. But questions immediately surfaced. Just days before, federal agents had raided his clinic, confiscating patient files, research data, and treatment protocols. Bradstreet had been using innovative therapies to detoxify children from heavy metals, substances he believed were introduced in part through vaccines. His success stories traveled fast. Thousands of families credited him with dramatic improvements. That made him dangerous. Bradstreet's research challenged dominant narratives. He didn't claim all autism was vaccine-related, but he did find consistent biological patterns: immune suppression, inflammation, toxic buildup. He published studies. He sought answers where others dismissed the questions. One of his most controversial investigations centered around an enzyme called nagalase. Bradstreet suspected it was interfering with the immune system and possibly being introduced intentionally through medical interventions. If true, it would have enormous implications. After his death, independent investigators began poking holes in the official account. Bradstreet was right-handed. The bullet entered from the left. The weapon was never recovered, despite exhaustive searches of the river. There were no signs he had planned to end his life. On the contrary, he had recently booked conferences, collaborated on new research, and assured colleagues he was optimistic about defending his work. And then, quietly, others began to die. Over a dozen alternative medicine practitioners researching similar topics were found dead under mysterious circumstances in the months that followed. Coincidence? Or something more coordinated? The medical establishment dismissed it as fringe theory. But for the families who relied on Bradstreet's care, his absence wasn't theoretical, it was devastating. His clinic never reopened. His online archives were deleted. His findings were discredited by those who never reviewed them. Bradstreet's story isn't about one man and one theory. It's about the fragile line between open inquiry and enforced consensus. About what happens when a healer dares to ask questions the system has already answered. He once said, The truth will always surface, but sometimes it needs help. Now it's up to others to help it rise. And we're left with this. In a world where medicine meets mystery, how many answers are lost with the ones who dared to look deeper? The deeper you dig into systems of control, the more fragile they appear. That's what Dr. Brandy Vaughn understood. That's what Aaron Swartz saw. And that's what John McAfee claimed he could prove. But Gary Kildall, he offered something different. A blueprint, not to destroy the system, but to bypass it. Gary's dream wasn't revenge. It was reinvention. And that's what made him so dangerous. His decentralized energy software, quietly coded in labs, tested among colleagues, nearly ready for release, could have done to the energy grid what the Internet did to information, liberated it, made it peer-to-peer, made every rooftop a power station, every neighborhood its own utility. Oil companies knew this. So did legacy power providers. So did governments. Which is why, shortly after Kildall's suspicious death, his research vanished. Not stolen for profit. Erased. As if it had never existed. That same pattern echoed in the final days of John Wheeler, whose findings on defense contracting fraud could have rewritten entire Pentagon budgets. It echoed in the lost files of Karen Silkwood, the unreleased exposé of Michael Hastings, the seized computers of Jeff Bradstreet. Every one of these people stood at a threshold, a moment just before revelation. Then, nothing. What unites these stories isn't just that someone died, it's that something disappeared with them. Data, evidence, systems, truths. Each death was followed not by closure, but by erasure. Digital archives wiped, research buried, testimonies canceled. And the same pattern held for Brandy Vaughn. Her death, like the others, was called natural. Her notes deleted, her videos flagged, her followers silenced. A quiet removal. When we talk about silencing today, we often think of censorship in loud terms, deplatforming, bans, takedowns. But the deeper threat has always been quieter. Disappearance. The removal not just of a person, but of their life's work, their story. In a world increasingly built on data, to erase information is to erase power. We tell ourselves that progress is linear, that the truth always finds a way. But what if it doesn't? What if some truths are snuffed out, their light dimmed, before it could reach us? And what if we've accepted this, not because we believe the official stories, but because questioning them feels too dangerous, too exhausting, too lonely? In the silences left by these lives, we are left to wonder, how many breakthroughs, how many shifts in the system have we lost, not to failure, but to fear? And how many more are we losing still, right now, because we didn't listen in time? It always comes back to the same pattern, not the drama of the deaths, the headlines, the statements, the official causes, but the timing, always the timing. They die just before a release, just before a hearing, just before a meeting, just before a story breaks wide open. 10 lives, 10 moments poised on the edge of revelation. And then, darkness. Barry Sherman preparing to testify. Jeffrey Epstein agreeing to cooperate. John McAfee ready to activate his dead man switch. Brandy Vaughn just weeks from legal testimony. Karen Silkwood driving to hand off evidence. Michael Hastings racing toward a story he warned could bring backlash. These weren't random tragedies. They were pivots, places where history might have bent in a different direction had the next day arrived. What's most haunting isn't that these individuals were silenced. It's how easily their truths were lost. Once a body disappears, it seems, the data does too. Servers go offline. Files are deleted. Testimony drafts vanish. Social media is suspended. Even physical documents are confiscated or destroyed. The world is left not just without a voice, but without a trace. What remains is the shape of absence. investigations quietly closed, trials never held, reform never made. The machine absorbs the damage and keeps turning, and we, the public, are left to ask, how much do we really want to know? Because behind each of these stories lies a system, a web of relationships between industries, governments, and infrastructures. A system that functions best when questions stop being asked. But these 10 didn't stop. They asked, they documented, they prepared to speak. And in doing so, they crossed a threshold where information becomes a threat, not a service, where knowledge stops being neutral and starts being dangerous. In every era, there are those who warn us. Some are scientists. Some are engineers. Some are mothers. Some are billionaires. Some are quiet. Others are loud. But they all feel something coming, something concealed. And they make a choice to reveal it. What happens next is a test, not just of courage, but of what kind of world we've built. Do we protect those who tell the truth, or do we bury them with it? Each of these deaths could have been a turning point. Instead, they became closed cases. The question isn't whether they were silenced. The question is, why didn't we listen while they were still alive? What if these weren't just stories of death, but stories of interruption? Each of these lives formed a thread, pulling at the fabric of power, of secrecy, of control. Each one risked unraveling a larger truth. And just before that thread reached the light, it was cut. 10 people, 10 warnings, and 10 silences that followed. We began this journey asking a question. Why do those who come closest to exposing hidden truths so often meet an untimely end? Now we're left with a different question. What kind of world do we live in where truth must walk in shadows to survive? These weren't saints. They were human, flawed, passionate, imperfect. But what united them wasn't ideology. It was clarity. Each had seen something real, something threatening to the structures that hold influence in place. And the system responded not with argument, but with disappearance. Maybe it's easier to believe they were unstable, misguided, delusional, because if their deaths were more than coincidence, we're forced to confront something darker. That knowledge alone is not protection. That access to power, money, or credentials does not shield you when you threaten the wrong interests. But here's the truth that cannot be buried. Ideas survive. Even when files are deleted, even when evidence is sealed, even when voices are silenced, ideas linger. They whisper, they spark, they move from one mind to another, and sometimes they bloom again when we least expect it. Maybe that's what those 10 hoped for, not to be remembered as victims, but as signals, as reminders that the quest for truth is still worth the risk, because this story doesn't end with them. It continues with us, with what we choose to question, to protect, to pursue. If we live in a time when truth-tellers are endangered, then we must become truth defenders, not with anger, not with paranoia, but with memory, with care, with a refusal to forget. Each of these names, Sherman, Epstein, McAfee, Vaughn, Wheeler, Swartz, Kildall, Hastings, Silkwood, Bradstreet, is more than a case. Each is a chapter in a longer story about knowledge, resistance, and the cost of honesty. We may never know exactly who silenced them, but we can decide whether their silence becomes permanent. So ask yourself, not what's been taken, but what still remains. Because in the end, the greatest threat to darkness isn't exposure, it's remembrance, and the light we choose to carry forward.